Well, I'm Alan, and some of you I know are familiar with the book, but for those of you that aren't, Johnny and I are two of the editors of what is basically a group memoir of integration at Murrah, primarily at Murrah in the early 70s. And it's different than a lot of books, that there's no author per se. There's three of us that are basically the collectors and the curators of these stories, and we contributed as well. But in general, it was just about bringing a whole group together after 40 years and trying to make some sense of our experience, being one of the first classes that attended our entire high school years under court-ordered integration. So it actually started out with Johnny and Teena Freeman-Horn, who couldn't be here today, arguing about this, like 35 years later, and having very different views of what happened to us at that time. And it just sort of went from there, and they realized they were onto something, that there was a bigger story, that they had interpreted their experiences differently. And it also occurred particularly to Johnny, because he has, like as I do, a sort of a historical interest in everything, realized that we were part of a bigger story that needed to be explored and needed to be recorded for posterity. And so they began contacting former classmates and trying to find out, what their recollections were and how they felt about it. And the thing just kind of grew from there. And then it was obvious that there was a book here. And so that's where I came in, because I was just basically conscripted at that point because I write books. And they did the real work and the heavy lifting and finding, making sure that we expanded the scope of the project to include everybody and all the different perspectives. And it was really interesting because, polling people 40 years later about their experiences in high school is highly problematic. I mean, everybody, some people remember things completely differently than others. Some people didn't remember certain things at all that were hugely significant to others. So it was illuminating in a lot of ways. And so, but we interviewed some of the classmates, some of them submitted essays, some of them filled out a questionnaire, and then we set about trying to make sense of all of this. And then we wrote our own recollections, and the book was the result. And well, that's pretty much my account of how I got involved and how I saw the book. I'm going to turn it over to Johnny, and then he's going to talk about it in a little more detail. And then if y'all have questions, we would be happy to answer them.
Alan downplays his role, of course, but I think all of us are trying to downplay it because it just turned into a massive thing. I way overwrote my parts, but Alan is a highly successful nonfiction book writer. If you haven't read Alan's stuff, stop here and read it, or go to Liberia or something and buy them, because they're great stuff. And when I realized that most of Alan's nonfiction work pertained to race, going back to antebellum times, my favorite book of his really grew out of old friendships that Alan and I have going back 45 plus years. But he started with slavery, sort of pre-slavery, I guess. Mississippi and Africa is the name of the book. It's my favorite book that Alan's written. If you haven't read it, read it. I'm a lawyer, and I have all of the baggage that comes with being a lawyer, including not much time. But Teena and I did get together. Well, let me take one step back. I thought what happened in 1969 through our graduation in 73 was a big deal. I always did. The reason is we rammed together two races in Mississippi that had never been rammed together in a place where everybody was presumptively equal. Nobody came into it in any sort of subordinate position. I can tell you the black people that we went to school with did not feel subordinate to us. And it was a social experiment, this massive social experiment conducted primarily by liberal federal judges from the Fifth Circuit, following the example of the, good gracious, I'm glad there are a few people here, following the example or the directives of the United States Supreme Court that by the late 60s had it with the South, primarily with the evasion of the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. It's been 15 years, and what had happened in Jackson, Mississippi in particular, was we had 2 or 3 black people in our class, beginning in the mid-60s, but it was surely, and this is a kind way to put it, it was token integration. The black people that were there didn't want to be there, and it was a horrible experience, I'm sure, for them to be hanging around so many, as I say in the book, white cliches. And they didn't have a very easy time of it, but nobody really knew what to do. The teachers didn't know what to do about it. And the students, we certainly didn't know what to do with our black contemporaries, at least pre-massive desegregation. And so we sort of existed that way. The Fifth Circuit judges just got fed up, particularly with Jackson. Jackson was a sort of a example, was made out of the JPS of massive resistance to the directives of the federal courts that thou shalt desegregate now. Beginning in 1968, they said all of this freedom of choice dodge to meaningful integration is over. By late 1969, the Fifth Circuit was saying, you shall desegregate by the end of the Christmas holidays. We went home for Christmas of 1969, and everybody knew something was coming, but we didn't know how disruptive and massive it would be. When we got 2 extra weeks for that Christmas holiday, which was great, and went back to chaos. The Fifth Circuit had ordered not only that staff and faculty be flip-flopped between Murrah and Brinkley. Brinkley was the top performing black high school in the city. And then 10 days on January 21 of 70, they handed down another order and said, we don't mean just faculty and staff, we mean students too. So, and we want the ratios of black and white in the schools to be the same as the ratio in the community, or at least in the school system. At least 40% black people would be involved. So when we came back, it was 400 or 500 black kids from Rowan coming over to Bailey to meet white kids for the first time, and a bunch of white kids saying, what in the world? And Jackson Prep got started that night in a meeting at the First Presbyterian Church because of the reaction of white parents primarily to the massive desegregation, the disruption, and the chaos at Bailey. A lot of people left, and those people never came back. But some of us, because of, thanks to our parents being, at least they wanted to get around all the cliches about race, and they were willing to sacrifice, I guess, our futures for it. But they stayed with it. My mother used to say, she would tell William Winter, look, Johnny's in as long as Lily, his daughter, who was in our class, is in. And she stayed with us through graduation at Murrah. But there were enough people that hung in there that it was about 35 to 40% white people through our graduation, except in the 10th grade we got sent to Brinkley, which was the previously all-black school that was a top-performing, really impressive place. And because the Fifth Circuit had decided to make it a 10th grade center, and that was total chaos for a year. And then we went back to Murrah for the last 2 years, and by the time we'd been together for 3 years, we discovered, what happened is we got past all the rubbish about race, we got past everything that we had been taught. I really think this is true. All the cliches, all of the stereotyping, everything that we knew about race, we finally were with each other long enough to get past it. and to get to know each other as individuals and make friends and move forward together. And so my thesis in the book is that it worked. It really, really worked at the JPS for about 5 years, the middle of which being 1973, our graduating year. It showed that you could put black and white together without any meaningful leadership. In fact, the leaders were counterproductive, with the sole exception of William Winter. And if you were exposed to each other that constantly, day in, day out, you played ball together, you did all the extracurricular stuff together, you got to know each other as individuals and push past all that mess. And it really worked. Had a 65% black majority, 35% white people at Murrah. And it's the only hopeful, I think, example of that kind of massive social experiment actually working that I know of in Mississippi history. That's why I think it was such a big deal. And that's why I think it needed to be remembered. That's what people that have read the book, that are real readers, people that, and I'm not one, I'm a lawyer. Real readers and people that know, care a lot about Mississippi and Jackson and history and little things like race, have called me and said, this is great, we've never read about this period of history before. All we know is that integration happened and didn't work. So now we have an apartheid secondary education system in Jackson. This lasted since 1975, 76. So it's a really good, hopeful story, I think. Everything was done wrong, but it worked out right, because it's just about people. And there's a lot of hope in that story. I wish that it had worked longer, but by the late 70s, it had fallen apart. So that's what we're writing about, a little bit, I think that it's important. I think it's a little glimmer of hope in a history that's not full of much hope at all, particularly in this town. Y'all got any questions? What do y'all want us to do? Yes.
You used the word chaos a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe some of the chaos that occurred for those students?
Well,
And I'm more interested in the students than for the administrators.
Oh yeah, well they were running anyway. The old people were standing around the principal's office saying, knocking out, he wouldn't let them in. They were just nuts. I'll tell you about what happened at Bailey. Al will tell you what happened at Chastain. We were both in the 9th grade. The first morning we showed up for school, February 1st of 70. There were a lot of people, Chastain people, had come down to Bailey, and looked like it was going to be pretty good because there were a lot of pretty girls there, a lot of people that my friends and I were watching. And about 30 minutes into it, 4 or 5 school buses pulled up full of Rowan kids, and they stepped out of the bus and started yelling at the white kids. It was a period of history. I watched this thing on ETV last night or the night before about the rise and fall of Black Power. And it's right in the midst of all that cultural influence, and the black people that we went to school with were interested in that cultural reference and influences and stuff like that, not nonviolence and getting along, holding hands and singing "We Shall Love God." What about that? They stood out there and hooped and hollered at everybody for a couple of hours. No classes met. They would not mind a single white teacher, administrator, anybody but a cop. They just wouldn't pay any attention to them at all. When they would go out there and say, come in this library or this auditorium this minute, they would hoot them away. And the teachers, administrators got it worse than we did, and we were getting it pretty bad. In the midst of all that, there was, as I write about in the book, there was one phone in the middle of Bailey, a pay phone, and the white girls were just lined up behind that phone calling Daddy, saying that they're here. And this integration thing isn't about changing schools. This is about going to school with a lot of black people. And all that day, mamas and daddies were coming, picking up white children and taking them away. And nothing happened that was good. No, we didn't have any leadership. Nobody stepped up and took the reins, and that really was the problem. That's what happened at Bailey the first day.
Yeah, I don't remember anything similar at Chastain. Chastain was, I mean, it was chaotic in the sense of anytime you completely overturn an old system and just sort of wing it from that point. There were walkouts during the year and that sort of thing for no obvious purpose, but other than everything was in flux. And people were, black and white, were both a little daunted by that and excited by that. I mean, we're just kids. It's kind of fun in a way for everything to unravel and to be a part of it. And I think that actually had a lot to do with how our classmates of both races at Murrah developed long-term friendships, because we were all a part of that and we all felt it. Maybe we didn't go into it, thinking we have a reason to stick with the public schools. I don't think most of the kids did. Maybe their parents did. But I think most of them were like, we're just here, and this is what we have to deal with. And it's easier to get along with people when you're in proximity and you're required to remain in proximity. And so at Chastain, it was, it was not, I mean, the main problem at Chastain, there was some disciplinary problems, but not so much. It wasn't chaotic in the sense of what Johnny described. But it was really just that for the first time, white people got a taste of the inadequate education system that black people had been dealing with for a long time. We had some incredible black teachers that came there, but we had some of the worst teachers I've ever had too, because their system was a completely different system. Ours, had a much higher level of accountability. And so I had some great teachers of both races, and then some teachers that were basically had no business even being teachers. And so it was a little bit chaotic in that sense. And a lot of our students, all white students, also left. And I left in the 10th grade and went to council school, not because of any problem that I had at Chastain, but because my best friend was going there, and it was air conditioned and you could drink Cokes. And that was kind of the limits of my worldview at that time. And I get into in the book how instructive that experience was for me, because I went there and I realized I didn't know who owned the council school, the Citizens Council. And I started reading all these like manifestos of the Citizens Council in the library, and got just totally immersed in it in a very, very perverse way, and kind of opened my eyes, oddly enough.
He got called to Bill Simmons, who ran the Citizens Council with his father, which he writes about in the book. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, I was 15 years old, and I was a young Turk, basically, and I started writing the head of the Citizens Council, rebutting all of their stories, and of course, going to their school. And after we went in and met with Mr. Simmons, my father said, I think it's time for you to go back to public school. And it was, for the longest time when I was at Murrah, I was embarrassed to tell people that I had gone to council school. It's like, that's even worse than prep, because it's like purely just a holding pen for white students. It made really very little pretense of being a school. But over time I realized that it was a part of my education, and I actually am glad that it worked out the way it did now, looking back, but it was just how I came to it. So, but a lot of most of the people that I knew at council school went there from Chastain for no real good reason, because there really weren't that many problems. It was just this feeling that, of drifting away from the public schools. And then a lot of students came back from council school in the 11th grade when we missed the Brinkley Center, although we would skip school and drive to Brinkley for some reason. And then in the 11th grade, a lot of them came back, and we thought, okay, this is the way it's supposed to work, This sort of let off steam, took the people out that were the greatest potential threat to integration, and kind of let them cool off, and now they're going to start drifting back in, and now it's all going to be fine. Everybody will see that it's not dangerous and whatever, and it seemed like that was true. Charles Irby came back from prep. Few people came back from prep, and a lot of people came back from council school. So we thought, well, okay, the tide has turned, and we're on the right side of history and blah, blah, blah. And we did think about that kind of stuff, but not as much as we thought of the typical things high school students talk think about. And so over time, it just didn't hold. And that's one of the things that we discuss in the book is why. You know, what happened? Like every year, there was like 2% less white students until it reached a tipping point, and then the whites just fled. And so it's not like that you can't get a good education at Murrah today. You can get a really good education at Murrah today, but it's not going to have the kind of cultural exposure that our class had, whether you're black or white. And I think that's one of the not happy parts of this story is that, you know, we really believed that it was going to work in the long haul, and it didn't. Anyway, those are two long answers to one question. So.
Okay, I just want to say something because I was the senior, and we were so mad. I have not been able to finish this book because I'm still so angry. But we finished. We had a play, we did the literary magazine, we cut school a lot. But once again, we never had the assembly that said, are we going to play basketball or, you know, do anything? We were just mad. We had our same schedule, and I'll just give you an example with no names. And I echo, there were some great teachers, and there were some teachers, but we went from AP English, T.S. Eliot, I had a paper half done, and we got in there, and the woman got up in front of the class and said, we're going to study Hamlet, and get out your pen and paper. Number one, King Claudius is Hamlet's father. And we were snotty at her. And I am embarrassed that we were not, I mean, but, you know, it was just awful. But we were not going to not have Murrah. We had 24 National Merit semifinalists. I was already in Vanderbilt early decision, and we were not going to let the courts and the whole thing wreck us. But we did not have, we had one or two black friends. But think about them. It was their senior year, and they had to go to a whole different school, and we never said, do you want to write? I mean, I have a lot of guilt about it, too, because we never said, do you want to be in the chorus? South, I think it was a great show, the literary magazine or anything, because, you know, they felt so awkward, and they were mad, too. And then it was also the same thing as every week there'll be fewer people there, because Millsats and Belhaven took people without a, I still have friends that didn't graduate from high school because they just went on. So, and when I asked Mother, my mother's kind of out of it, she's 92, but she said, you know, we just waited too long, and the liberals, they just thought eventually it would happen, but she went, why did we let it go so long? I mean, it was the whole lack of the leadership, and, you know, we were supporters of the winner. Ann Winter was my age, she graduated from Murrah. I mean, it just, you know, it's just such a mess, but I'm really glad y'all have written this book, and I'm so glad that y'all think you're successful, because we were not. But we were bound and determined that we were not, you know, Murrah was still going to be an excellent school. And I now have a granddaughter there. The AP classes are wonderful, but there are 11 white students. And that's just not right. I mean, you know, for a city to have, like you say, an apartheid system is not, I mean, we've just got to do better. But I mean, I think in some, like the community service, I mean, I think there are, kids are getting together across racial lines, but this is just such a mess. So anyway, I'm glad y'all have written a book.
One of the things that I discovered after I left Murrah, and I talk about it a lot in the book, and so did some of the black kids that were involved, is that black people didn't want to be at Murrah. You know, we went into it, I certainly did, thinking that that white people were giving up everything for it, that we were the ones that were sacrificing our expectations, our quality of our education, our great sports teams, all of the stuff that Murrah High School meant, and it meant a world to me growing up. We all write about it in the book. But black people have the same expectations about going to Brinkley. I mean, Brinkley was a great school, state champion in basketball, had the best basketball coach in the country, probably, who came over to Murrah, thank goodness, or from Georgia. But, you know, it was my 10th year class reunion that the catcher, I played baseball, the catcher on the baseball team came to me and said, Johnny, we didn't want to go to Murrah more than y'all didn't want to go to Brinkley. What about that in a minute? And said, and you know, I found him later at the 10th year class reunion, and it was a wing-ding thing. But I said, you know, I really have always thought that we're the ones that sacrifice, not y'all. y'all stood only to gain by being around us. And it was, and I said, you know, that's not only racism, that's the meaning of racism, the way I felt about y'all wanting to be with us. You know, and there were counterparts in the black community to what we developed at Murrah High School in the 60s. And it was Brinkley. Lanier was more inner city and not quite as, Cassandra told us and other black students told us that where Brinkley is, which is over by the Jackson Mall, was the area of town where all the black educators lived. It was a black middle class and up community. It was a really fine group of people who cared about the public education and did everything my mom and daddy did for their children. And that was not only jerked away, Brinkley was destroyed. They just shut Brinkley down. It was a 10th grade center my 10th grade year, our 10th grade year. 10th grade center the next year, and then they made it a junior high school. So what had been the best black performing high school in Mississippi, really, but certainly in Jackson, was completely sacrificed to integration. And it really is a unrecognized problem with what happened in massive desegregation. That shows a lot of the racism on the part of the white judges who were trying to be as liberal, more liberal than now in these orders they were handing down. It's really true.
How do you have a question?
Yeah. I was struck that no one readied y'all.
Readiness?
You said you arrived and you didn't know
Nobody
that
did.
the Great Integration Day was there, and nobody prepared you.
No, there wasn't. I don't think.
Imagine.
I don't think that, and if there was a real problem, say in the book, it was the lack of leadership. Nobody stood up and said, this is what's coming and why. And this is what you're going to be facing when you get back and why.
That would have been helpful.
And William Winter told us that he went to the head of the school board that Christmas and said, look, go on TV and say, we know it's disruptive, y'all, but hold the course. The Jackson Public Schools, Murrah in particular, has meant a lot to the white community over the years. So hang in there. Don't make this gut reaction, which is really what it was, the fight or flight response that most white people felt. Hang in there with us. Well, Governor Winter said, the guy turned to him and said, that ain't my job.
Who was that?
Well, I really don't want to name the name because
Is it in the book?
No, I just put it in the book either.
We can look it up.
Well,
Yeah,
isn't
just
it
you can look it up.
this is your new friend, you know, there was no, like, you would have thought the leadership group, you would have had some meetings or some
Well, they
folks
were
in the
house
afternoon.
attorneys. The general public.
I think they wanted it to fail. I think a lot of the white administration wanted to say, I told you so. We could not do this. It's too disruptive. And we all admit in the book that it was too disruptive. It was too much too soon. I mean, I don't know how you could have prepared us for it, frankly, except to say, hold the course. We'll straighten this out in the long run.
Well, had the adults just acted like they were in charge, like you say, nothing's more terrifying for children than to see the grown-ups run into the principal's office.
That's exactly
and
right.
them terrified, like acting like they're, don't know what to do, that's so silly, but I mean, but
And our
that's
best,
terrifying for children.
and our best teachers stood by the windows. I remember my favorite teachers just standing by the windows and saying, what are we going to do? It really was
Just
without.
leadership.
It was
But just to, on the other side of that, those black students who, as Johnny said, gave up, you know, their schools, then they come into a school like Murrah, where some of their teachers literally will not even teach to them. You know, had them seated in like 2 rows by the door, and then taught to the white students, and never even looked at the black students.
Yeah.
And I didn't even realize, because just like Johnny was saying, you know, you enjoy a kind of privilege, you know, and you don't even notice these things, you know. And it wasn't until we started working on the book and talking to our black classmates, because nobody mentioned that to me at the time that was happening. But then they started asking, I wouldn't have tolerated that, I mean, it's hard to imagine that they just would not even acknowledge that the black students were in the classroom. And I guess those teachers were just hanging on for retirement, and I'm sure left as soon as they could. But there were so many things that came out when we were working on the book that I was kind of embarrassed that I had never known at the time. That, I mean, we just were all trying to get along, and I think, by and large we did, but there was obviously a lot that we missed. even being in the middle of it. But the one lesson that I really took that came to me from talking to everybody and reading everybody's contributions was that there's just nothing like proximity.
Yeah, that's it.
I mean, now people are isolated in so many ways, and I think it shows when you look at the national political environment. People now choose to isolate themselves in any number of ways, and I don't want to overstate what happened. I'm not trying to put this gloss that it was this racial Shangri-La when we were there. But the fact is, we were forced to exist in close proximity, and it worked out. There were no really big problems that came out of it. And I think that kind of opened all of our eyes. I don't know what it did in the eyes of the adults, but those of us that were participating in it, you have to sit next to somebody, and eventually or play sports with them. Eventually you just find common ground. Every day for 2 years, you get up and you go, and you're in proximity to them. And I think that's the sad thing about integration having not persisted in the Jackson Public Schools, is that the kids are not growing up with that kind of proximity. And everybody says, oh, it was too much too fast. And it probably was in terms of the long-term outcome, because it did influence people negatively, but I didn't feel that at the time. I mean, I just felt like when you're 17 years old, every year is completely new and different. And I just felt like, well, this is it. This is the next thing. A year ago I was reading about how scientists have proven that black people are genetically inferior and mentally inferior to white people. And this year I'm going to school at black majority high school. It's just life changes, And by the way, there's somebody over there that I need to talk to about our homework assignment. And, whatever. You just deal with it, And we went over after football games. We would have parties at different people's houses, black and white. Not as much as we would have because we lived so far apart. But we did do it, and we had a good rapport, for the most part. And we have, had the reunions as well. And that was really when it occurred to me that I would see there's this middle-aged black guy that I knew for a year in high school, and we start talking, and suddenly you realize how similar your view of the world is. And it's because we were produced by the same situation. And I think that shows in the book that even though we don't all see it the same way, and some people looking back, it was a horrible experience, which I never would have guessed at the time. And then some people make it's very nostalgic. But in general, it was very obvious that everybody was so directly influenced by the experience that it still resonates in their life today, and that we have that in common. And I'm just sorry that a lot of kids in high school are not getting that exposure now, and it makes me feel really fortunate that we did.
So how many of your classmates participated in this book? What percentage would you say?
It's just over 50.
And most of them are white. One of the things, I don't think that it has a white imprimatur, because one of the things that we felt very strongly about was that we did not need to be the ones that were trying to determine what this story was about, because who wants to read a book by 3 white people about integration, And so we sought out, in addition to the people who just voluntarily contributed, we actually did seek out, contributions from our black classmates, because just because you can't tell the story fully. Everybody has a different perspective. I learned so much from them, really. When I look at the book now, I basically just sort of scan and read the contributions from my black classmates, because those were the most enlightening to me.
And how would you say they differ? What were some of the big differences between y'all's experiences in there?
Well, just one of the things that I mentioned earlier about not realizing that they had to give things up. Like Johnny said, like, you know, we're white people, we're the center of the universe. This is happening to us, and the black people are just like our co-stars. You know, that's the way the white people see it. Because you can afford to see the world that way when you enjoy a position of relative privilege. And to suddenly find that they were going through the same kinds of ordeals that I had totally missed at the time. I mean, you know, we saw some things happen, like some black students got harassed for being too friendly with white students. Little things that you saw were a little challenging for them. But I think the biggest thing was just knowing that they gave up just as much as we did. And I think we were all kind of in the same boat in that regard. Can you think of any other examples of things that we learned along those lines?
Margie Cooper, really pretty girl in our class, came to my office and I just loved hearing her talk about it. But she said when it started, they had to walk 4 or 5 miles. They didn't have any transportation. You know, here's a fairly isolated but insular community of black people that had been living in the same place for a long time. They're told they got to get to Murrah, you know, to Baylor, 4 or 5 miles. So they didn't have any carpools. They didn't have mamas.
No buses at first.
No buses at all. They walked. And they had to hike to Murrah. And I remember seeing black kids just strung all along Woodrow Wilson, crossing that bridge and walking out.
I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, there wasn't any facility for it. What the course decided to do about it was order school busing. Well, that became the whipping boy for all conservative objections to integration for 25 years.
And just a historical note, see, we had neighborhood schools, so we walked to school. When you went to Dooling School, you walked, or your mother took you.
So nobody had school.
So nobody had school buses.
Okay.
JP, I mean, we were, you know, JPS didn't have buses.
You had proximity. We had some school buses for people that came from Plantation Boulevard, which I thought was farther out than you could get. Now it's right in the middle of, you know, what's in North Park Mall. That's where everybody lived. They were bused to power, but the reality was those facilities weren't set up for black people. White people like Tinker and I going to Brinkley every morning in his daddy's old yellow pickup and my daddy's 1959 Plymouth station wagon, and we could stop by Campbell's Bakery and get brownies and drive to school like white small kids. That didn't happen with the black kids. They had to, I don't know how they got there, frankly. Margie said they just kind of hiked. And it was that kind of lack of foresight and lack of preparation that made it very, very hard, mainly on the black people.
One other thing I'd like to add to your question about what we learned. You know, when we were in the 11th grade, when we had to do we had to vote for 2 of everything. We had to vote for, like, if you were voting for beauties or most handsome, whatever, you had to vote for a white one and a black one. And for all the officers, you had to vote for a white one and a black one. And we thought this was so magnanimous, you know, like we were including them. Never mind that they're 65% of the student body. And it just never occurred to us because we were just viewing it from the narrow perspective of comparatively privileged people. And then when we started working on the book, you know, I forget who it was that brought it up the first time, but she said, it was obvious that y'all were still in charge. You know, that we had to vote for a white beauty, you know? And it was like, oh, I saw it completely differently than that. I didn't know that was, but it was totally ridiculous now.
It's totally ridiculous.
Yeah.
But it was about appearances, and appearances mattered.
But except for the Mr. and Miss Murrah High School, and then you could only vote for one. And so we got Nancy Powell and Fred Sheridan. And she was like,
pictures in the book.
Yeah, the pictures in the book, it's great because, you know, she's this like demure, blonde white girl, and he's this black guy with this stern look and an afro, and they're standing up there in their prom get-up, and it was, I'm sure, scandalous in some sectors, but looking back, it's one of my favorite pictures.
It's a perfect representation of what we went through. Chrissy?
So, first, have you had some interesting reunions? And second, most important, did you learn to clap on the first beat instead of second?
We learned all of that by being together every day and having it pointed out if you didn't. But one thing about our class is we're remarkable for our reunions. Strangely, once we started writing this book, they kind of petered off, but for years, we were having a class reunion every year because we loved seeing each other. And it was, frankly, it was black people that I wasn't as close to in high school as we are on reunions. Now we just love each other after reunions, more so than high school. But it's because there was something, I think everybody realizes we went through something unique, and we want to try to keep it going, because I don't know any other example of Mississippians being put in the place we were and coming out. I've said that before, but it's really true. I don't know any historical parallel to it. What is odd, I tried to go back as a lawyer, because reading a 2007 decision of the United States Supreme Court is what got me fired up about this. 2007 Supreme Court, I say in the book, took the clarion call language from Brown versus Board that was taught to me with great respect and honor in law school. This is the best the courts have ever done. The executive was powerless, the legislative branch was powerless. And here comes the court saying it's inherently discriminatory to put black kids in one school, underfund that school, and expect them to compete in what's supposed to be an integrated society where everybody's protected by the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. No more, they said in 1954. Well, by 2009, the Supreme Court was saying this, written by the Chief Justice, who's exactly our age. He went to a boarding school in La Lumiere, Wisconsin. And I don't think he met very many black people, but he said in 2009 that we're going to strike down any program where black people that encourages diversity, that says you have to have black people involved in the school system, because that in and of itself violates equal protection. The Equal Protection Clause is about striking down racial classifications of any type. So anything that favors black over white violates the Constitution. That's a real long way from Brown versus Board, and then the late 60s decisions that said we're ordering school desegregation primarily to combat the history of de jure or by law segregation in the South. We don't know any other way to deal with 300 years of keeping black people down. Our idea, the courts say, is to start everybody in the first grade together in the public schools, take them through the 12th grade, and by that time we should have at least the beginnings of a truly integrated country. Well, I said that wonderful language from Brown went from, I'm quoting another historian in the book, but it went from to a platitude, and now it's been used as a punchline. It went from a paradox to a platitude in our time, to now that language from Brown versus Board is used as a punchline by the court. Clarence Thomas said, if we learn anything from history, it's to avoid white elites with racial theories. That was his whole take on the history of the attempt to have desegregation in our public education system, to avoid whites bearing racial theories. So we've gotten, it's not come full circle. We're in a whole different universe now in the way that we treat this very problem. Back then, we were put there, the courts were saying, to fight a history of by-law segregation. And it's kind of weird that you put the children in the front lines to do that, but that's what the court decided to do. And it worked. It's the odd thing for the few years that enough white people hung into the JPS to keep the percentage of whites over 25%. Coach Lee told us if you got below 25% white involvement in a public school, then the whites would pull out.